Welcome to my channel. Enjoy this video and subscribe my channel. Greg Chillak and Joan Kruchov's cross-cultural love story is playing out on the current season of 90 Day Fiance. But it's clear that Greg's meddlesome mom, Lucille Chillak, wonders about Joan's motives in marrying her son. Like a lot of relatives of 90 Day Fiance cast members, Lucille is concerned that Joan is potentially using Greg as a way to come to the US. Lucille may have her reservations, but Greg's lifestyle in the US is a far cry from what Joan is accustomed to in her native Uganda. If Lucille were realistic, she'd see that Joan, who was a director of a non-profit organization in Uganda, actually took a step down by coming to America to be with Greg. Greg is 35 years old and doesn't have a steady job. Joan, 26, moves into Greg's house he shares with his mom, Lucille, 68. Again, a very standard scenario on 90 Day Fiancé. But Joan understandably isn't happy living with Greg's mom. Lucille has tried to make Joan feel welcome, but there are some moments where it's obvious Lucille doesn't trust Joan. There are some moms and sons who are close, and then there's Lucille and Greg. They live together on Long Island, and Lucille treats Greg like he's still a baby. She caters to him, cooking and cleaning, and reminds him to straighten up his room like he's a kid. In Greg's first episode of 90 Day Fiancé Season 11, he described growing up in an Italian household and learning to love cooking through watching his mother Lucille. It inspired him to dream of opening his own bakery, but he admits that his work ethic is a little low. Greg bakes for the neighborhood, but isn't anywhere close to opening his own bakery. As a protective mom, Lucille said that she was going to be paying attention to the way Joan treated Greg, since Greg could be a little naive when it comes to relationships. Greg, who struggled with his weight, didn't have a lot of experience with women. Lucille was there to make sure that Joan and Greg's relationship was genuine. As Joan prepared to land in the U.S., Lucille dropped a bombshell on Greg, saying that when Joan arrived, she wanted them to sleep in separate rooms. Lucille said the idea of Joan and Greg sharing a room made her uncomfortable. She seemed specifically concerned that she would be able to hear things going on in their bedroom. Greg said he'd run it by Joan, but he neglected to tell her Lucille's idea before she arrived. Lucille said Joan could sleep on a futon in a separate room, at least until they were married. Greg was now in a position where he had to run interference between his mom and his fiancée. From the moment Joan landed, Lucille seemed a bit put off by her. On her first night, Joan was exhausted from the long flight and didn't want to socialize much with Lucille. Lucille seemed annoyed. Greg is already concerned that Joan and Lucille won't get along, which would mean he would need to find a place for them to live sooner. Greg isn't in a financial position to do that, so he's nervous. Joan took a shower as soon as she arrived at Greg's house, and Lucille commented on the length of Joan's shower. When Joan woke up the next day and took another shower, Lucille began to complain about the amount of showers and the length of said showers. Lucille might have intended to make Joan feel welcome, but her policing Joan's showers is awkward. It seems like Lucille's attempt to establish dominance. Part of Joan's culture is that whomever she marries must pay her family a dowry to prove that he can take care of her. Joan's dowry is $3,000, which Greg cannot afford. Of course, when Lucille finds out about Joan's dowry, she rolls her eyes. Lucille is trying to accept Joan and her culture, but it's obvious she doesn't understand the purpose of the dowry. Lucille even said in a confessional, "The dowry? Don't start me with that." Lucille feels like Joan is putting too much pressure on her son, and she's not happy about it. Lucille is grateful that Joan has been pitching in around the house. Joan does housework, like mopping the bathroom, which Greg would never offer to do. After Joan told Lucille she'd prefer if Lucille spent more time away from the home, Lucille tells her she's offended by that. In a confessional, Lucille asked why Joan would utter those words. Why would she say something like that? I have been very accommodating to them, so that sends off signals that maybe she isn't an appreciative person. Lucille seems like she wants it both ways. She wants Joan to be grateful she's able to stay in her home, but she also wants Greg to step up and create a home for him and Joan. Lucille acts like Joan is ungrateful and is offended when Joan says she'd be happier living separately. Lucille should be supportive of Greg and Joan getting their own place, because at Greg's age, it's about time he left the nest.